He entered to a grisly scene. Slumped on the bed was the bloodied corpse of a middle-aged man, a bullet hole notched in his head. Beside the bed lay the man's suitcase. It was stuffed with manuscripts, some new, some ancient, written in English and Hebrew among other languages. Nearby was a stack of business cards. Kramer slipped one from the pile and took down its inscription. M.W. Shapira, bookseller and antiquarian, agent of the British Museum, Jerusalem.
That was journalist Chanan Tigay reading from The Lost Book of Moses, The Hunt for the World's Oldest Bible. Here we learn of the tragic end of renowned antiquities dealer Moses Wilhelm Shapira, found dead in his hotel room just months after becoming a global celebrity for discovering what he claimed was a manuscript of the Book of Deuteronomy written by the hand of the biblical Moses himself. What kinds of documents matter? How do we determine what is authentic and what is fraudulent? What insight can new archaeological discoveries, whether real or fake, provide into the worlds of ancient Jews or Israelites? Welcome back to Season 2 of Cite and Sound, the Stanford Jewish Studies podcast. Here we host conversations with scholars and artists as we explore Jewish scholarship, culture, and history. On today's episode, journalist and creative writing professor Chanan Tigay shares his journey into the true story of a man, a manuscript, and a scavenger hunt around the globe to solve the mystery of a long-lost Bible. Tigay joins Jewish Studies faculty director Vered Shemtov in conversation about the colorful world of biblical antiquities dealers and what even forgeries can reveal about the past. And now, the conversation.
Good afternoon, Chanan. Welcome to Stanford. It's wonderful to have you here.
It's great to be here. I always love coming down here. Beautiful.
Yeah. I thought I will start by saying that the book traces your quest to uncover the story of an ancient scroll that was discovered in the 19th century. And maybe discovered is not, the right word, since it's not clear whether the scroll was genuine or a cleverly crafted fake antique. And I'm not going to give
No
the
spoilers.
ending. No spoilers. There are many adventures and revelations along the way, and perhaps to give the listeners a sense of the narrative, we could follow one main thread. Perhaps the fascinating story of Moses Shapira, which is a really colorful and complex figure. So I wanted to start by asking you if you could tell us in a few sentences who he is and how is he connected to your story?
Absolutely. And first off, thank you for having me. I'm really thrilled to be here. As a writer of nonfiction, I'm often jealous of fiction writers because they get to invent these incredible characters. And as a nonfiction writer, you have to find incredible characters. And oftentimes, it's a very, very difficult search. Moses Wilhelm Shapira is a character I could never have invented. This is one of those cases where I think truth is stranger than fiction. He was an antiquities dealer in Jerusalem in the late 19th century, but he wasn't born in Jerusalem. In fact, he was a Jewish guy, a sort of yeshiva bacher, who was born in Kamenets-Podolsk, which has at different points in history been part of Russia, been part of Poland. In any case, at a certain point, he and his grandfather left Kamenets and headed to Jerusalem. Somewhere along the way, Moses Wilhelm Shapira converted to Christianity. And by the time he arrived in Jerusalem, he was an Anglican Christian. He joined up with a group of other converted Jews in what today we call the Old City of Jerusalem, and became a member of Christ Church. Because in those days, it was sort of economically speaking, it was not a very excellent proposition to be a Jew in Jerusalem. But the Christian community was well funded by people from the outside, particularly in this case from England. So Shapira shows up in Jerusalem with nothing. He is now a Christian. He joins this community. And ultimately, after studying how to be a carpenter, essentially, opens up an antiquities shop in Jerusalem. Then I'll fast forward a bit to the year 1883. And that's where the sort of heart of the story in the Lost Book of Moses takes place. When Moses Wilhelm Shapira, by then an antiquities dealer, shows up at the doorstep of the British Museum in London, and he claims to have in his bag the oldest manuscript ever discovered of a portion of the Bible. He says it is the book of Deuteronomy, Devarim, the fifth and final of the 5 books of Moses. Only his version is extremely strange. It's nothing like the version they knew then or we know now. It is shorter. Much has been removed from the version we know now. The 10 Commandments aren't the exact same 10 Commandments. Some have been swapped out from other chapters in different books of the Bible. The order has been switched, etc. And his claim is that not only is this the oldest copy, the oldest manuscript of the Bible ever discovered, but that in fact it may have been actually written down on the page by none other than Moses himself. And here's the other caveat. He's asking £1 million sterling from the British Museum. In 1883, £1 million sterling is something along the lines of $250 million today. The British Museum had never paid anything even remotely like that. They'd bought something called the Gold Cup several years earlier for £10,000. And so he shows up, oldest manuscript of the Bible in the world. Maybe Moses wrote it, wants £1 million for it, and the world really freaked out. People were extraordinarily excited by this. Shapira overnight became a sought-after dinner guest in London. The Prime Minister of the UK himself, William Ewart Gladstone, shows up at the British Museum to take a look at this manuscript because it turns out he can read biblical Hebrew, and he is so impressed by what he sees that he goes off and starts raising or trying to raise £1 million himself to make sure that England doesn't lose out on this fantastic relic to their international competitors, France and Germany. And Shapira, meanwhile, is being feted all over London, being written about in the pages of all the big newspapers of the day. And meanwhile, back home, his wife and daughter, who are about to become, 2 of the richest people in Jerusalem because their husband and father is off about to make £1 million, are blowing exorbitant sums back home on credit because everyone knows the news. They've been reading about it and excited about it. And so this goes on for several weeks. Meantime, the British Museum brings in another Jewish guy who converted to Christianity, a guy by the name of Christian David Ginsburg, who is one of the great Bible scholars of the day. And they ask him to translate and transcribe Shapira's very, very strange manuscript, which was written, I should say, on leather strips, about 15 of them. It was discovered, he said, in caves near the Dead Sea. It was full of variant readings on the traditional text. This might all sound a little bit familiar to you guys. I'll get to that in a second. But meantime, Christian David Ginsburg goes into the bowels of the British Museum, begins working on the manuscript while Shapira is being celebrated all over the place. And he comes back about 4 weeks later and he says, "Hold your horses. It's a fake. It's a fraud." And Shapira is, of course, crushed by this. He had staked his reputation on this. He was a self-taught man, but he really, really respected men of greater learning, people of the academy. And this was a great embarrassment to him with them. Not only that, but financially speaking, he'd staked his life and his career on this. And here was Christian David Ginsburg coming out and saying it was a fake and it was a fraud. So Shapira goes off on a 6-month bender in Northern Europe where he writes letters that he never mails. He leaves suitcases behind in cities, just abandons them there, and ultimately ends up in a really seedy hotel in Rotterdam in the Netherlands, where 6 months after all of this comes out, he takes his own life because he's just so distraught by what has happened, which is tragic. But then you fast forward about 6 decades, and the Dead Sea Scrolls are discovered in caves near the Dead Sea, full of variant readings from the traditional text of the Bible. The second most numerous among the biblical books discovered with the Dead Sea Scrolls is Deuteronomy, the exact same book that Shapira had brought to the British Museum. And so folks thought, my God, it's almost exactly the same story as the discovery of Dead Sea Scrolls. Shapira had even said his scrolls had been discovered by Bedouin wandering in this area. I mean, the story was almost identical. And so folks thought, my God, he discovered the first Dead Sea Scroll 60 or 70 years before the rest of the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered. And he was pushed to his death because he had the unfortunate circumstance of making a discovery way ahead of its time. And at this time, the notion that Shapira's manuscript could have been the original book of Deuteronomy was quite a controversial proposition. Now when we hear, oh, the Bible was stitched together from many different texts and there are different authors and biblical critics call them J, E, P, and D, and there are books and books and books written about this. Back then, that was not at all the case. And so it was really a sort of big controversy. And yet, when the Dead Sea Scrolls are discovered, the thinking is, my God, maybe because it was so controversial back then, we simply couldn't see the truth. And now the Dead Sea Scrolls had proved that it was all authentic. And so folks decided, all right, we're going to reopen the investigation and we're going to see if they were real or fake. But in intervening 70 years, Shapira's manuscript had somehow mysteriously vanished. No one could find it anywhere, not at the British Museum and not anywhere else. And so this book does two things. At once, it tells the story of Moses Wilhelm Shapira, which is really a wild story. But then it goes back and forth with chapters of me traveling all around the world to, I think it was 8 countries on 4 continents over the course of about 5 years, trying to either track down this missing manuscript of Deuteronomy that Moses Wilhelm Shapira had brought to the British Museum in 1883, or at the very least, to prove whether or not it had been real or fake.
So part of it is if he was real and fake, and part of it was the book real or fake. So they're kind of two stories together there.
They are, and and Shapira didn't really make it easy on himself, I should say, because a decade before he brought this Deuteronomy manuscript to the British Museum, he had brought about 2,000 clay statuettes that he again claimed had been brought to him by Bedouin, and that he claimed were Moabite statuettes. So meaning they came from the people of Moab who lived east of the Jordan River. And what was amazing about it at that time is there had been no cultural history ever discovered previously of the Moabites. And so they'd been mentioned in the Bible, but this was supposedly sort of proof that they really existed and a real physical connection to them. And yet these statuettes, which were, speaking of wild, I mean, they were sort of like these grossly depicted sexual things happening. They had this weird scroll on them that people thought maybe was this mysteriously disappeared Moabite language, but no scholar could make heads or tails of it. In any case, he sold these to the government of Germany. It was called Prussia at the time, and they were really high on having gotten these things into their own royal museum. And then it turned out that they were fake. They found the guy who had done it, and the question was Shapira part of the ruse, or was he just a dupe who had been essentially sold a bill of goods and then sold them on? No one's ever really proved one way or the other, truth be told, whether he was the dupe or part of it. But at the time, he was essentially let off the hook for having been fooled by someone else. But when he came to the British Museum a decade later with the Book of Deuteronomy, he had that reputation to contend with, but also the reputation of a legitimate antiquities dealer who had already sold to the British Museum dozens of authentic, very old copies of the Torah that had been acquired, and I use that word carefully because some people say he had stolen them from the Yemenite Jewish community.
Interesting. What was the most meaningful aspect of your 5-year journey searching for the truth about the manuscript?
So I'll speak about two things. One is a sort of meaningful professionally, and one is meaningful personally. I'll start with the professional. I think this was my first book, and so I think I'd always had in mind that getting a really great review in some newspaper like the Wall Street Journal would be extremely meaningful, and I'd feel like I really made it. And I was lucky. I got a lot of really good reviews in really great newspapers, and that was meaningful. But then, at some point in the process, a very, very well-known scholar named Immanuel Tov, who was a longtime professor at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem and also the head of the Dead Sea Scrolls project for many, many years. So really the world's leading expert on the Dead Sea Scrolls. He wrote a review of the book in Hebrew on a website dedicated specifically to biblical scholars, which is to say it doesn't have a giant readership. And yet when his review came out, and it was a very nice review, he said nice things and essentially that I got it right, which was a big fear of mine. That ultimately, professionally, for me, was the most meaningful of anything that happened, because I really felt like if Immanuel Tov thinks that I got this right, There's no one else whose opinion I really need to solicit on this. So that was extraordinary. On a personal level, my father is a Bible scholar, and not just a Bible scholar, but specifically a Deuteronomy scholar. He spent 16 years writing a commentary on the book of Deuteronomy that's, 5 or 6 inches thick. And growing up, the word Deuteronomy in my house, Dvarim, was like goodnight moon or peanut butter and jelly. It was just the kind of the context in which I swam because my father was working on this book the entirety of my childhood. And so, the idea that I could be searching for what was potentially the original copy of Deuteronomy that might have something to say about this book on which my father spent so much of his life working, that was extremely exciting and meaningful. But even more than that, because he was a Bible scholar and because I grew up with his friends as people who really sort of populated my life, all these other incredibly erudite Bible scholars, I was scared to death of getting it wrong, getting the biblical part of this wrong, getting the scholarship part of this wrong, that people were going to say, Tigay's kid really screwed this up. And that was sort of always in the back of my mind, a fear of mine. So on the one hand, I wanted to write a book that was accessible to the public. It really is a mystery. That's how I thought about it the whole way through. I'm writing a mystery. But it does have this scholarly element, and I really, really, really wanted to make sure I got it right. And so in order to do that, I was very lucky that I had one of the world's leading Deuteronomy scholars who would always take my call, that being my father. He's a night owl. He lives on the East Coast, and I live out here. So almost every night, I think, several times a week, over the course of the entire time I was writing this book, I'd call him at about 9 o'clock California time, about midnight in Philadelphia, and we would discuss this. And I would go over everything I was discovering and what I thought it all meant, and he would respond. I would give him copies of what Shapira's manuscript said so that he could translate it for me so I could make sure I got it correct. And so ultimately, I think that was the most meaningful part of it all, was being able to really sort of forge this different kind of connection with my father over the course of several years working on this.
So many things happened in these 5-7 years that you worked on it. What was the most surprising thing in this journey?
Yeah. I mean, there were many, many surprises along the way. I don't want to give away too much in case anyone here wants to read it. But the most surprising thing was, I searched for years and years and years to try and find, or at least prove, as I said, if this manuscript was real or fake. And I traveled repeatedly to Germany and the United Kingdom and to the Netherlands and to France and to Australia and to Israel and to Jordan. And in each place, it was really like I hit brick wall after brick wall after brick wall. I can't tell you, how many times I would show up in a place to find documents that I was told were there, and then it turned out they had burned in a fire. It happened to me repeatedly. And I thought, is someone up there, not want me to find this for some reason? And so in 1884, when Shapira died, a great San Franciscan by the name of Adolf Sutro, who was the mayor of San Francisco, he was also a German Jewish immigrant to San Francisco and one of the great book collectors of his day. He had one of the largest book collections on earth at the time. He happened to be in Jerusalem when word got back to Jerusalem that Shapira had died. And the German consul in Jerusalem knew this and got in touch with him and said, you got to get to Shapira's shop on Christian Street in the Christian Quarter. You have to get there immediately and you buy up everything that's in there. And so Adolf Sutro, for 200 pounds, bought everything that was left in Shapira's shop. Just an incredible collection of stuff. And that was part of Sutro's collection. Much of his collection burned in the earthquake and fire of 1906, so back to burning documents. Thank God the Shapira collection within his collection did not. It survived. And he ultimately donated what remained of his incredible collection of books to the state of California upon his death. His collection bounced around to a whole bunch of different locations over the course of years, and I think there was even some sort of internal strife within his family as to where it should go and who should get it. Ultimately, it ended up on the 5th floor of the San Francisco State University Library,
Which
the
is
J. Paul
where
Leonard
you-
Library, which is where I happen
where
to
you
be a
were,
professor.
yeah.
So I learned about this, and first of all, I was shocked, to find that these manuscripts from across the world had somehow turned up on the fifth library of the university where I taught. It was an incredible surprise. Now, I had just started teaching at SF State at the time, and they had just moved the collection to SF State, so it was still in boxes. So when I got there, they said, you can't come look at it yet. So I was like, oh my God, okay. And I had to wait until they managed to get it out of the boxes and sort of stored and taken care of and, as they needed to. So that was the first delay. But then as I hit brick wall after brick wall after brick wall, as I mentioned, it began to dawn on me that it might well be that this collection of Shapira's stuff from his shop when he died, where I thought maybe it's just possible that the missing manuscript of Deuteronomy from 1883 in the British Museum turned up. If it's not there when I look there, that's pretty much the last place I can look. It's the last stone I can turn over. And if I don't find it there or prove its authenticity, then I have failed. And so I just put it off and put it off and I'd be like, oh, I got to donate blood. Sure. I've got to do anything else but go there. And I waited a very long time, literally until a week before my book was due, when I finally managed to sort of get over this mental hurdle. And I said, I can't not go and look at it. That would be it's my job. It's a dereliction of duty. I had sold this book already. So there were people who had paid for it and were waiting for it. And so I went in, and within 30 minutes, and after they rolled all these manuscripts in on a cart, I made a discovery that sort of blew the whole thing open for me. And I had to go home and rewrite the entire ending of my book.
I'm not going to ask you about that. I'll leave
Good.
it as a surprise. Where did you get the idea to study this or to investigate it? I mean, I've never heard of it before I read your book.
I hadn't heard of it either. So I was sitting around Friday night dinner with my parents, back home in Philadelphia visiting. And I had just written a series of articles about the discovery of Noah's Ark on Mount Ararat in Turkey. They discover Noah's Ark every year somewhere. And so they had discovered at this time, it was a team of Chinese evangelicals. They had gone to the top of Mount Ararat and they had found wooden beams that they claimed were the remains of Noah's Ark. It became a huge international story. It was reported about everywhere. And then within several days, it became clear because one of the discoverers, quote unquote, came out and acknowledged that this was a fake. It was a fraud. They had actually months earlier dragged a bunch of wooden beams up to the top of the mountain, let them sit there for a while and freeze over and claim that it was Noah's Ark. So we're sitting around Friday night dinner. I was telling my parents about these stories that I had just written about this. My father essentially said something along the lines of, you want to hear about a real biblical forgery? And it turns out it was the first biblical forgery. And he started telling me the story of Moses Wilhelm Shapira. And I, like you, I couldn't believe I'd never heard of this before. And I was instantly hooked. And I began digging and digging and digging and reading. And the more I read and the more I dug, the more crazy and mysterious the story and the man himself, Shapira, became. So I didn't initially think, I'm going to write a book about this. But it gradually became clear because of all the twists and the turns that there really was an incredible book to be written about this. And, I think to really write a book like this, you have to be obsessed. Because if it takes 5 years, there are going to be frustrations along the way. And you're going to think you're failing. And the only way to make it through to the end is if you're genuinely obsessed with finding out the answer to the question you're seeking. And I genuinely became obsessed. And 5 years later, The Lost Book of Moses was out.
And it's nice because on, part of the book, you meet other people that are obsessed with it, and it becomes interesting, kind of, who's going to be the first to have an answer to this question.
Exactly. I mean, that's what it was. There's a subculture of people who call themselves Shapira maniacs. They are obsessed with the story, and I couldn't blame them. I had the same obsession. Some of them had been looking in the same way I was for 30 years to see what they could turn up. And so actually that was extremely daunting for me initially. I thought if they've been at it for 30 years, I've got so much catch up to do that I might just never make it. But my uncle is a journalist, and he told me, He said, if they've been looking for 30 years and haven't found it, you're going to catch up with them really fast, right? If they haven't found it yet, they're not going to find it. So it was incredible to, on the one hand, to say like, oh my God, there's other people who have the same disease I have. It felt like I'm not alone. There's places to look. And many of them were very helpful. And others were less helpful. There was an Israeli documentary filmmaker who, actually two Israeli documentary filmmakers, one of whom initially said, this is great, let's work together. He liked my ideas. He said, we'll share information. And it turned out that I did a lot of sharing of information, and he did not. And then there was another guy who was a documentary filmmaker, and he initially was very helpful. And then at a certain point, not only sort of stopped being helpful, but really, I think behind the scenes was agitating to make sure that I didn't get ahead of him, was sort of trying to thwart my search in certain ways. And he was initially successful in it, although ultimately I managed to overcome that obstacle.
Yeah. It's not surprising that people from the film industry will be interested in that, because when I read the book, when you heard the story, you thought, oh, this could be a great book. And when I read the book, I thought, oh, this could be a great movie. Maybe one day.
Knock on wood.
Yeah. The story is also a window into the world of antique dealers, especially in the 19th century, but also beyond. Can you tell us a bit about what you learned about this world of collectors? And then it includes also universities, scholars, and thieves, right?
Yeah.
It's a real Indiana Jones kind of universe.
Actually, it was not her, she's famous now, but Barry Weiss, now the head of CBS News, when my book came out years ago, was reviewing books for the Wall Street Journal. And she did a video review of it. And she's in it. She said, it's like Indiana Jones if Indiana Jones were a Jew from San Francisco, which is maybe my favorite line about the book. So antiquities dealers are a really interesting breed. On the one hand, their interests overlap a great deal with my interests. And I love talking to them because they're often the very first people to see things and handle things that have been hidden from the world for thousands of years. They really are gatekeepers in that way. And so I love the opportunity to talk to them. On the other hand, they are part of an industry that, because these pieces that they sell become very valuable, lead to people out in the field sort of trying to find them and dig them up on their own to sell them to these antiquities dealers. And what that does is it sort of destroys the scientific integrity of the site where the pieces are being located, because the people digging them up are not scientists, they're not scholars, they're not archaeologists. They are just people trying to essentially earn a living. And so there's a real debate in the scholarly world about whether any archaeological items that have been discovered outside the confines of a scientific archaeological dig should actually even be considered, talked about, written about, studied by scholars, because there's no way to know, frankly, if, generally speaking, if they're authentic, because doing so encourages more people to go and dig these things illicitly. And so there are some people who say we shouldn't even look at these and talk about them. And there are other people who say, if you ignore these things that are coming onto the market through illicit channels, you really might be missing some of the greatest discoveries that are possibly coming into our hands. The Dead Sea Scrolls, of course, being the primary example of incredible archaeological discoveries that were made outside of a scientific archaeological dig. That all being said, it's incredibly interesting talking to these folks. Anyone who deals with antiquities dealers will tell you that a significant amount of what is on their shelves is fake. Some of them, maybe all of them, know it. Maybe they were fooled by the people who brought it to them. So that's one interesting aspect of all of this. But, I think I probably fall on the side of people who say we have means now, scientific means, to test the age and in a certain way the authenticity of an archaeological discovery. And so, yes, while on the one hand, having scholars investigate these pieces, I think, does lead to more illicit looting of archaeological sites, for sure. I worry that we would lose out on so much of historical value if we don't pay attention to these things.
Mm-hmm.
But I will say that some of the antiquities dealers I have met are among the most colorful people I've ever met in my life.
Interesting. And did your sense of what is an original text and of our ability to get a sense of the original version of the Bible change throughout this whole process?
Yeah, that's such a great question. I mean, when I hear original, I think sort of like I'm thinking authentic, the most authentic, whether it's, the Jersey Babe Ruth won in the World Series and, when he won the World Series, people want that because it's the most authentic thing. Or, a copy of the book of Deuteronomy that may have been written by Moses himself. I remember when I was in college, I used to eat lunch like every day at a food truck, and it was called Leanne's. It was like really good Chinese food. And literally a block away, there was a food truck called the Original Leanne's. And then a block from there was one called the Real Original Leanne's. All of them were trying to sort of be the most authentic version of the Chinese food truck on the campus. And I thought about that, believe it or not, a lot when I was doing this. I think in the end, I think what mattered, I sort of came to realize was that what really matters is sort of the content of the thing and not the kind of ancientness of the thing. I spoke about Moses William Shapira selling all of these supposedly Moabite statuettes to the Royal Museum in Berlin. So I went to the Royal Museum in Berlin because I knew that they had a bunch of these fake Shapira statuettes still in their collection. What I was really shocked by when I got there was that they were actually in the process. They were going to renovate the museum, a giant renovation. But before they could take all of the stuff in the museum out of the museum and store it, they had to make sure it was solid enough, stable enough to survive being moved out and then stored and then moved back. And when I got there, they happened to be restoring several fake Shapira statues. And they spent hours and hours and days and weeks doing this and a humongous amount of money doing this on pieces that they knew were fake, right? They had no real historical value.
But by now they're old fakes.
Well, they're old fakes and they're famous fakes associated with a now famous and exciting story and character. And so in their way, they became authentic. They are now authentic Shapira forgeries. And there's a market for those things. In Jerusalem, I went to the home of the guy who used to run the Rockefeller Museum in East Jerusalem, where the Dead Sea Scrolls were originally worked on. And he's got a bookshelf where he's got 2 bookends, which are fake Shapira heads from that, and he spent money on these things. And so my definition of what is original or what is authentic really did change because, while initially it was like, oh yeah, what is original, maybe this first copy ever written of the book of Deuteronomy, by the end it was, oh my God, that's an original Shapira fake. And that has meaning and value of its own.
And the fake pieces that you did see there, were they a fake in a boring way, kind of random, or were they interesting, new versions of things that
I think
were not fake?
what was so surprising about them is that when you look at them now, they appear so obviously to be fakes. They're really ridiculous looking. But back then, it was sort of, these were among the first kind of biblical fakes that were made. This wasn't an industry in the same way as it is now. So people didn't think about things in these ways until they were much more credulous than we would be today. And so I think that's what sort of surprised me the most was that you look at them and you think, my God, how could anyone ever have been duped by this? And yet they really were. The entire government, the Prussian government, including a future Nobel Prize winner in one of the sciences, were so excited to have these things, so completely depressed when they found out they were fake, that they literally passed a law in the government, like decreeing that these are fakes to sort of let everyone know we know this and we are scientifically accepting of this. And so that was what was surprising for me. But also the flip side is what I said before, that despite everyone now knowing that they're fake and sort of ridiculous fakes, they are still valuable, and real scientists and conservators and archaeologists spend time trying to make sure they survive because they've got such a great backstory.
So this is such a great story about such an important book. Where do you go after you finish writing something like that? What's your
Well, first, what I try to do is earn back all the money I spent traveling around the world trying to find it. But I guess you're asking, what am I working on now?
Yeah.
So I'm a little superstitious about talking about it. So I will, in broad strokes, say that it's actually not. I sort of, after this book, I was like, I'm never going to write another book about this stuff. I spent enough time on it. And yet, here I am working on a book now about hundreds of manuscripts that were written about the same time as the Bible by many of the same types of people who wrote the Bible, starring many of the same characters who are in the Bible, and yet didn't actually make it into the Bible. They were left on the cutting room floor. So there are many of these books, not many, a number of these books that are sort of famous. They're called the Apocrypha. And then there are hundreds more that aren't actually the Apocrypha, which are sort of, the top level of books that didn't make it into the Bible. They're still considered, really important by certain religious sects. Then there are all these other books that didn't even make it to that level, were hidden away in many cases for many, many years, and are very little known to people outside certain religious circles and academics, I think. So the book will essentially be about these texts. And I'll just say that, what's interesting to me about it, there are many things that are interesting, but I just got back from Israel where I spent about a month visiting sites that are mentioned in these books and where worship sites and different festivals actually still exist, where hundreds, sometimes thousands of people come together to worship based on stories told in books that were very deliberately left out of the Bible, in some cases actually outlawed. But the power of their stories has endured for many people all these years later.
Another fascinating story.
I hope so.
We actually have a really popular course that is cross-listed with Jewish studies that is called Texts That Didn't Make It into the Bible.
Yeah.
So it looks like we have to have also a winter quarter course on the text that didn't make it into the course of the text that didn't make it into the
It's
Bible.
a very meta kind of course that they're teaching. Yeah. But I saw that that course being taught, and I've been in touch with the professor. And I remember thinking when I saw that Stanford was offering it, I wish that course was being offered when I was an undergraduate. I would have been there for sure. When I was an undergrad, I look back on myself and wonder what I was thinking. But if my class was before noon, there was very little way I was going to make it. That class I would have showed up for.
Nice. So we always end our podcasts with the same question. And we ask our guests if they can share with us a Jewish text that they feel is especially relevant to today or particularly meaningful to you at this moment.
Yeah. So I mentioned that my father is a Deuteronomy scholar, and he wrote his commentary on Deuteronomy. And he wrote two things when he inscribed the book to me. One of them is Vigatem bo yomam v'layla. So you should essentially engage with these Jewish texts day and night. And the other thing, I think this is Talmudic, I think maybe Ben Bogbog, someone would have to correct me on that, said of Jewish literature of the Torah, hafoch ba ve'hafoch ba dechula ba, which means sort of turn it and turn it because everything is in it. Meaning, anything you need to know you can find in this book. And what I really like about that is it's just a sort of very Jewish approach to literature, which is to say, you can look at it from one angle and learn something, but the learning isn't done then. Switch, look at it from another angle, consider something different, and you might learn something new here. And I love that because I think it applies not only to the Bible and to religious texts, but to literature more broadly. It means something, what you read means something different to everyone. It might mean something different to you if you read it today and read it 5 years from now and 10 years from now. And even if I, read it right now, maybe there's some angle to it that I'm not considering. And if I just sort of open my mind a little bit and think about it from a slightly different angle, I'll get something new and interesting out of it. And so I really like that approach to literature. And I just love that it's, it was originally said about the Bible, but I think it can really be applied to books and texts more broadly.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for having me. This was great.
Today's episode was produced by me, Shayna Hammerman, with help from Eva Clem. Sound editing and design by Romy Kiorian. Original music is by Jeremiah Lockwood. Cite and Sound is a production of the Toby Center for Jewish Studies at Stanford.
Stanford University.